Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I am doing something a little different. I will be offering tips and tricks on how to solve a mystery novel. And I don't want to brag, but I don't always try to solve the murders in mystery novels, but when I do, I fancy I have a pretty strong track record. I say about 75 to 85% of the time when I'm trying to solve a mystery novel, I can at least accurately predict who done it. I almost never get like all the way there. I miss a lot of like the twists and fail to interpret some clues. I never like really get the full mystery solved. I almost never use like the actual clues in the book, but rather meta clues. And we'll get all into that. And I will not be spoiling any book by any author in this video. I'm just talking about generic terms and tips. And before I begin, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel to keep up to date. And once again, I apologize if my voice is off. I have some kind of like sore throat again. I don't know what it is, but you'll just have to deal with it for this short video. I apologize in advance. Now, these tips are not foolproof. They will not work every time. Authors are always trying to subvert our assumptions and play with our biases. They are aware of these tips and tricks, and we're always trying to find ways to play with readers' minds. These tips work most of the time, but an extraordinarily well plotted and written book will get around these. On the flip side, a very poorly plotted mystery will also cause these tips to fail because they don't follow typical logical patterns and cluing. The absolute most important tip I can give you is to know the author. Different authors have different styles of writing mysteries. They value different things. Some authors will not use women as murderers. In particular, male American authors use male murderers a lot. Ellery Queen rarely used women as killers, especially earlier on, but he does occasionally use women. You have to know what a writer values, and you can only really get this knowledge from reading multiple books from them. You could do like biographical research to gain some insight, but I don't think that's as strong a tactic as simply reading their books. Does the author value love? Will he or she split up a loving couple by making one of them a murderer? Or is love too powerful and that will be avoided? Patricia Wentworth will never split up a couple in love. The traditional pattern of a murder mystery is that the murderer upsets the status quo and tranquility of society. The hero comes in, solves it, and the chaos is removed by having the murderer arrested. Thus, the murderer will be someone who society is better off without. No innocent person's life will be negatively impacted by removing the murderer from society. How dedicated is a mystery author to that ideal? Golden Age authors were very much so, but present day authors not so often. There are certain places certain authors will not go. Authors are people and they want their ideas and their beliefs to shine in their works. And I know this is all kind of vague, but I don't have a specific way to get into this without spoiling anything. You just have to know an author's style. This next tip is pretty basic. I think everyone knows this, but it's worth mentioning for inclusion's sake. The murderer is going to have certain characteristics. The murderer is going to be someone introduced to the reader early ish on in the book and have a decent number of pages dedicated to them. They are all widely accepted and used rules of detective fiction. The murderer is not going to be like the unnamed store clerk who had one line of dialogue. It's not going to be someone whose existence you didn't even know about. It's going to be someone who is at least a supporting character and probably has like a larger role than merely supporting. This is not a rule of detective fiction per se, but if the book is written by an American, the murderer is going to be an American, and if the writer is British, the murderer is going to be British. And they're probably going to be white. This is especially true in the Golden Era. There's typically a lot of like ickiness thrown, the way of people who like, aren't white or aren't British or aren't American, but they will not be the murderer. And even in more recent mysteries set in the US and Britain, we rarely get anything but white murderers. And none of this is to state my opinion on anything or to get into like uncomfortable debates. This is merely an observation. And one last thing here is that the common belief that the murderer is the least likely suspect is like almost always not true. Mystery readers know to look for the least likely suspect. So even like early mystery writers know to not make like the least likely suspect the murderer. That's a twist so many of them have used so many times is that the murderer really was the most obvious person all along, and you just fell for the trappings of a mystery novel. Now, getting into more specific tips, let's talk about timelines. Timelines are garbage. So many mystery novels lure the reader into establishing these really firm and strict timelines as a distraction. You never need to establish the timeline properly. Any book that has a very clear and unmovable timeline uses it as a red herring. Whenever there is a timeline like this, the murder didn't happen when it appears to have happened, making the timeline totally useless. Very specifically, the murderer is probably someone who is cleared by that timeline, someone whose alibi is well established, regardless if there is a timeline or not, is suspicious. Poirot often says the flimsy alibi is actually stronger than the solid one because the flimsy one is clearly the alibi of a suspect who didn't know they would need one ahead of time. But timelines are designed to distract the reader from anything else. They are very time consuming and need a lot of attention to set up properly. They are often repeated constantly in a book, and it's all for naught. Again, whenever this happens, you should look for the person who has the strongest alibi and suspect the murder happened either before the events of the timeline or after the events of the timeline. Another tip is identifying group dynamics, especially family dynamics. Now, this one probably has more exceptions that I can think of, but generally speaking, whenever there's a large group of people, typically a family structure, the murderer is someone outside the family or outside the main social or power structure established in the book. Murderers are so often depicted as people trying to infiltrate society and wreck the status quo and flip society or a community in their favor. And in the rare occasion the murderer comes from within the main social structure, he or she is usually on the outskirts of it by virtue of being like an in law, a new member, or the black sheep. The black sheep in particular is the most common exception here. Someone whose removal from that social structure does not hamper the success of that structure. Whenever you have a large dysfunctional family, the motive is almost always money, and the victim, is the person who controlled the money. The motive is always money, but especially with books with large dysfunctional families. So that's always something to keep out for. The important thing here is the main social structure or the stability of a community, if you will, has to remain intact by the end of the novel. And this relates back to know your author and knowing whether or not said author will wreck the stability of a community or not. And more often, the answer will be no, especially from a golden era author. And this next tip is extremely important and involves the five senses, or more often, just seeing and hearing. It is much easier to pull the wool over your eyes in a book than it is on the screen, which is why some books don't translate well. The readers don't actually see or hear anything. We're only told what the narrator tells us, and writers have a way of manipulating words, which is so easy to trick us when we cannot actually see or hear what is going on. Any mention of dim or bad lighting, darkness, nighttime, it means someone is either in disguise or otherwise not who they claim to be. Someone is in a costume or wishes not to be identified. Anyone who has a scarf over their face or their hat tipped over their cheek or something. Anytime one character is talking to another person through a closed door, the person on the other side of the closed door is not the person who it should be. This can mean any number of things. Most commonly, it means the victim is already dead, but it could mean anything. The other speaker may or not be in on the trick. In general, anytime the author presents a scene in which someone or something is seen but not heard, or heard but not seen, it should be a red flag that a person is in disguise or something sinister is afoot. Disguises are super common in some authors' works. Again, this relates back to knowing your author, because some authors like Agatha Christie use costuming and disguise tricks often, while other authors like Niall Marsh shudder at using costuming clues. These types of disguise tricks are sometimes considered cheap tricks, and while I would disagree with that, there are authors who will not use them or use them much less frequently than others. Another tip that's pretty obvious is when there is some kind of chart or map or letter reproduced in the book, it's important. Most commonly we see this with layouts of a house or a train or a boat or something like that. Whenever there is a map reproduced in the book, that means the layout is important, typically indicating how the murderer moved about. So keep an eye on alternate routes from one place to another. Typically, a map will show just the rooms and other locations, but the map also indicates where the furniture is located, or, very importantly, where light switches or fuse boxes are, one of those items is going to be important. For charts, keep an eye on family trees, which is a pretty good indicator of lines of inheritance, but there may also be like some like other relative listed who is, may play a factor even if they're not in the story. Letters. Whenever a letter is reproduced in the text, something in it is important. You should read between the lines, as the letter read as is probably is going to mislead you. Look for words misspelled or the same word spelled differently. Unclear pronoun antecedents is important. The names used in the letter. Is the letter addressed and or signed? Is the letter dated properly or not dated at all? Are the pages in the correct order? Is the letter whole or are there pages missing? These are some of the easiest clues to discern because it's all right there. You don't have to imagine it in your head. No, another important indicator of who the murderer is positioning. The murderer has to be in position to pull off the murder. They have to have some kind of control over the situation. Murderers are often people with some kind of power, the power to make decisions and arrange the scene in their favor. In a mystery novel, the murders are almost always premeditated, which means the killer has to set things up to their advantage. If a murder takes place in a country house, the killer typically has to be either the head of the house or someone with the ability to make decisions for the household, like arranging the furniture, deciding which rooms to use for certain events, dictating the household routine, putting on the central heating. A pretty big indicator in a country house mystery, letting me know the murderer is an outsider, is if the murder happens outside the house, like in the open garden or lawns, or if some kind of artificial construct is set up outside the normal routine. This tip isn't that helpful when a murder occurs in like a public place, but is very helpful for like the house, the business, the workplace. In public settings like a train, like a boat, a park, things that are wide open and often no one has control or more knowledge of the location than anyone else. So this tip isn't that useful there, but it is useful for like, the typical country house mystery. A big one is occupations. There are certain occupations to be wary of. Doctors, nurses, and other medical professionals are probably the biggest one. Doctors have access to a wide variety of poisons most people do not have access to. They know anatomy and know how to exactly strike or stab someone. Doctors are often trusted individuals. They know a lot of personal secrets and family dynamics. They're often given access to people's homes. You have to remember, in the Golden Age, doctors made house calls and would often have like a very select clientele of wealthy individuals. Doctors are often consulted to assess a dead body, even if they are not working with the police. They can lie about time of death, cause of death, and no one can contradict them. They know all kinds of quirks about the human bodies and how bodies will react in certain situations. Somewhat similarly, lawyers are another occupation to watch out for. I don't mean like the lawyer character who shows up for 2 pages to read the will or whatever. I mean any major character that is a lawyer. Lawyers also know a lot of secrets. They often oversee estates and accounts. Lawyers are also trusted individuals, even though they have a reputation for being shady and liars. People have no choice but to trust them, and lawyers stereotypically don't have high morals. They are depicted that way in mystery novels. No, they are often, know their way around their clients' personal lives. Lawyers often are on retainer for wealthy individuals, and when you put a dishonest person in charge of $1 million estates, bad things happen. Lawyers can easily forge documents, their clients' signatures, etc. The third occupation discussed here is performers, specifically actors. If you follow the All About Agatha podcast, they sound that alarm whenever a character is an actor or has acting skills. Actors are very good at remaining calm under pressure, deceiving others, impersonating other people. They are quick on their feet, can change clothes quickly, do different voices. Depending on how famous an actor or a character is, he or she may be above suspicion due to their fame and popularity. Actors' suspicious behavior is often dismissed as them being temperamental and artistic. Actors are believed to be more likely victims than culprits, so an author may obfuscate in that way. There are other occupations that are more likely to be guilty than others. Policemen, for instance, can control a scene after the murder happens and manipulate events and evidence in a certain way. I would say policemen are more common killers in like present day mysteries than in the golden age where they're supposed to be viewed as like these moral, uptight people. The policeman cannot falter or hurt society in any way. One of the most common ways a mystery writer hides clues is in a laundry list. We might not get a literal list, but often we do, and these lists can be anything. It could be, the narrator listing what furniture is in a room, what clothing people are wearing, articles in a newspaper. It could be anything, and it might be a literal list, or this information may be presented to us over the course of some pages. If the information is presented in a literal list, the important item to note is probably in the middle somewhere. If the information is spread out, it can be anywhere. This is a classic trick authors use to hide information very easily while still playing fair. Names. This was a particular favorite of Agatha Christie. Anytime a character has a nickname or changes their name or uses a stage name, it's important. The legal name is typically what's important because that is what's used on legal documents like wills, marriage certificates, death certificates. In particular, you have to pay attention to someone whose nickname does not begin with the same initial as their legal first name, like Betty and Elizabeth, Bella and Arabella, Drew and Andrew. Initials are also something to be aware of because characters tend to monogram items with their legal initials and not necessarily the name they go by in everyday life. And multiple characters may have the same initials, so that could be misleading. By manipulating and playing around with names, an unscrupulous person can claim money that isn't theirs, intercept letters and packages that aren't theirs. You also have to be careful of people who have similar or the same names, like Barton and Burton, or two people who have like identical first names. Another important trick to learn is how to spot red herrings. As I've talked about before, a good red herring is incorporated into the plot so that it cannot simply be pulled out of the novel and have the story remain intact. These are red herrings that are extremely difficult to spot, and I don't have any tips to give you there except that you should always be aware of an author leading you down the wrong path. That the storyline that is being presented isn't actually the story of what's going on. However, spotting less good red herrings is much easier, and I do have tips for spotting those. First of all, you can pretty much suss out what is a red herring based on like the mood and feeling of the book, vibes if you want to use that word. They feel out of place and extraneous, and dare I say, padding. You can easily discern these red herrings pretty easily. They feel forced in there to provide like a motive for someone who doesn't have one. When reading a mystery novel, there's going to be some kind of like twist at the end. So any motive presented to you right away is probably a red herring. Something is going to come as a shock at the end, so anything revealed immediately, again, a red herring. Anytime there is an investigation to like a non-homicide crime, like drug smuggling, illegal weapons, jewel thefts, even like a political intrigue or angle, it's probably a red herring. An exception to this would be like any crime involving money, because money is like the most common motive. So like embezzling or stealing money are probably like 50-50 red herrings, especially if it's a large amount of money. A small amount of money, probably a red herring. Another exception to this would be if the hero is a professional police officer, because they do normally investigate these crimes. Inspector Allen, Inspector French do often find themselves caught up in other crimes like, forgery or, drug smuggling and jewel theft or what have you, and these do often relate back to the murder. But amateur detectives, less so. The amateur sleuth is going to be more interested in psychology and the intimate lives of characters. The ultimate murder is going not to have something like drugs or jewels or what have you. And the final tip here is basically a laundry list of my very own, but all the items here are important. It involves casual or throwaway references. It's actually similar to the laundry list in that the author is playing fair by providing you the information, but burying it so deep you don't even notice it. So be aware of casual references to the following: an inheritance or unexpected windfall, someone having been abroad for a long period of time, someone mentioning a dead relative, someone recognizing a face or an object but not remembering where they saw it previously, any character who is mentioned frequently but never appears on the page, acting skills, someone mentioning they went to or going to Harley Street, which means that they're dying, someone having some kind of disorder like color blindness, deafness, lack of ability to smell, etc. That typically means their testimony is going to be unreliable. Anything said by a member of the help, anything said by someone other people ignore or find annoying, any line of dialogue that doesn't make sense within the larger conversation, any two events that seem disconnected but happened around the same time, and pretty much, anything. I know it's not much to say, but anything that gets mentioned in passing could be important in a mystery novel, especially if it's mentioned in passing multiple times with no further follow up. And that is it for this video. I apologize once again for my voice. I have like a laryngitis or something. I'm not sure. Hopefully it will be cleared by next week, because next week I have something I think a lot of you will enjoy. I've seen this actually requested a lot, and luck would have it that I already had it on the schedule, so I didn't move anything around for this. But a number of you have mentioned your favorite Christie novel is Crooked House. And next week I will have a full review of one of Christie's greatest novels, Crooked House, so stay tuned for that. Make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with the channel. And until next time, Mystery Files,